Nat Turner and the Black Imagination, Memory, Power, and the Double Standard of Violence. Last week I gave you the lecture on the collapse of white security, how Nat Turner's revolt forced Virginia lawmakers into months of crisis debate, how it shattered the illusion of Black submission to slavery, asserting that slavery was natural for Black people and that it was stable. Turner's revolt, we explored how Turner's revolt exposed the fear inside the system. It created a cultural, shall we say, sensitivity, fragility, where there would never be peace within slaveholding states as long as Black people were in chains. This debate showed also that Black people were not chattel, they were not tools and instruments or cogs in the machine, but rather Black people were a force to be reckoned with. You do not spend months debating about whether or not slavery is worth it if you don't believe that the people who are enslaved are indeed a force to be reckoned with. But today I want to explore the other side of that story. Not just what Turner did to white security, but what Turner did to Black consciousness. Because revolutions don't only shake governments, they reshape imagination. Now, someone asked a very fair question. Is there data on Nat Turner's impact on Black consciousness? And the answer is yes, but not the kind of data we're used to. Enslaved people weren't running surveys. They weren't publishing peer-reviewed journals. They weren't free to write openly about revolt. So the evidence comes differently. It comes through Black oral tradition, free Black newspapers, abolitionist speeches, testimonies recorded by white observers, post-emancipation memory, the way Turner echoed, the way Turner's name echoed in Black intellectual history. And when you line those sources up side by side, a pattern emerges. Nat Turner became a symbol on day one, not just of revolt, but of possibility. White slaveholders complained, according to historical records, that enslaved people whispered Turner's name with what they called strange reverence. That's data. Indirect, but powerful. Free Black newspapers like Freedom's Journal treated Turner not as a monster, but as evidence that enslaved people were not passive. Black abolitionists like Henry Highland Garnett echoed Turner's theological framing, resistance rooted in divine judgment. The Black church carried Turner's memory forward. Turner was a preacher. He spoke in visions. He interpreted history through scripture. And even when later preachers didn't name him explicitly, the pattern of prophetic resistance vision, judgment, deliverance remain embedded in Black rhetoric. After emancipation, Black communities preserved his story. White communities tried to suppress it. And this attempt at white suppression is evidence of Turner's power and influence. And in the 20th century, scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and later James Cone reclaimed Turner as a figure of moral force and theological lineage. That is not myth making, that is intellectual inheritance. Turner became a template, not because everyone utilized his methods or endorsed his methods, but because revolt exposed the truth about the system. And perhaps the clearest data point of all, white fear that enslaved people admired him. They feared Turner and his death more than they did in his life. When the oppressor fears your influence, that is evidence of impact. But then we run into something else. Every time Turner is discussed, somebody feels the need to say, now, we're not glorifying violence. We don't condone what he did. And many people are mixed about whether or not to unapologetically embrace Turner as a hero of the faith. And here's the honest question. Why don't we say that when we teach the American Revolution? Why don't textbooks begin with, we're not glorifying violence, before describing the Boston Tea Party, the tarring and feathering of Loyalists, or the killing of British soldiers? Why is one revolt automatically patriotic and the other automatically needs to be qualified? Because American violence, when performed by its founders, is framed as righteous by default. Because American myth making teaches us that the American Revolution, was a part of God's divine mandate. But Black resistance is not. When many people speak about Turner's revolt, the first thing they mention is that women and children died, as if the entire event can be reduced to casualties. And those deaths were tragic. But what is rarely acknowledged is that the American Revolution itself included civilian casualties, including women and children. But this is not emphasized in the history books, and nobody apologizes for it. What is also important to note is that the American Revolution included an internal civil war between the Loyalists and the revolutionaries. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Women and children were displaced and impoverished. Diseases broke out. Women and children died. And in some cases, women and children were killed in frontier violence. Yet we do not reduce the American Revolution to those casualties. We contextualize them within a broader political struggle and still call it the birth of a nation. I will admit, Even I had not fully considered how much the revolution functioned as a domestic civil war until I revisited the record. That realization, rather, forces us to ask why one upheaval is framed as tragic but noble, while another is framed primarily through its victims. The difference is not simply about loss of life, it is about how memory is shaped, whose suffering is centered, who gets the benefit of innocence, and which struggles are granted moral legitimacy in the telling of American history. Understand that there is a double standard. The colonists revolted over taxes and trade restrictions, and women and children died as a result. Not slavery, not dehumanization, not inhumane brutality, but taxes and trade restrictions. Enslaved people revolted over their bodies, their families, their humanity, their dignity, their right to exist as human beings in this world. Yet, the group enduring incomparably greater brutality is the one whose resistance must be softened with disclaimers. That is not about ethics, that is about narrative control. When white people died in Turner's revolt, they were described as sacred innocents. Once again, when white people died in Turner's revolt, they were described as sacred innocents. When enslaved Africans were thrown overboard on the slave ship Zong for insurance claims, the court debated property laws, not murder. You should look this up. The Zong massacre. The court actually debated property laws, not murder. So within this context, white suffering was memorialized. Black suffering was normalized. White death was tragedy. Black death was paperwork. That moral hierarchy did not disappear after slavery. It shaped the way the nation tells its own story. So when we add disclaimers to Turner's revolt and are somewhat hesitant to fully embrace Turner's revolution, what are we really protecting? We are protecting a myth. The myth that American violence is noble. The myth that the nation was born pure. The myth that enslaved people were passive. Turner destabilizes all of that. Because if the colonists had the moral right to resist minimal oppression, then enslaved people had a considerable and astronomically greater claim. And that truth unsettles the national imagination. That's why Turner is remembered carefully. That is why his revolt is narrated cautiously. That's why textbooks soften him. Not because the facts demand it, but because the story does. So, what did Turner do in terms of real impact? He collapsed white security, but he did something else. He revealed fear inside the system. You will not sleep comfortably as long as Africans are in chains. And when oppressed people see fear in the oppressor, as they did in the case of the aftermath of Turner's revolution, something shifts. There's a power that comes with seeing fear in the oppressor. Turner became spiritual inspiration, psychological proof that resistance was possible, political evidence that slavery was unstable, Cultural memory then passed through generations. Turner became cultural memory passed through generations. And Turner became intellectual lineage in Black theology and scholarship. He lived on, not simply as a man who fought, but as a man who revealed. And revolution and revelation is powerful. Because once you see the double standard, once you see how violence is narrated differently depending on who wills it, once you see how moral language protects power, you can't unsee it. You just can't. And when the narrative shifts, consciousness shifts. And when consciousness shifts, history moves. Please click the subscribe button so that I may be able to increase my number of subscribers here on YouTube. And please sign up for one of my several Udemy courses that I have. I've embedded the link to my Udemy courses inside the description. Thank you so much.